heed to any authoritarian scientific claim, no matter from where it sprang, was intentional and carried out scrupulously. I can add to this my earlier determination to disregard any threat to my existence from church, state, or political parties that might endanger my line of research. I experienced the power of unbending search for truth with just as much surprise as a pathological dreamer and scoundrel in Germany must have experienced the social results of his consistent lies. The search for truth is closely connected with the natural organization of the human animal. Hence, we may conclude that the evasion of truth and the adherence to the surface of phenomena must also have a certain connection with the structure of the human animal. The function of natural research must be buried somehow if the tendency to evade obvious facts is that powerful. With this thought, I found the key to the riddle of why man could err so consistently, so cruelly, for so long, and so much to his own disadvantage. Needless human erring is a pathological quality of human character. Here some self-examination is again in order. Am I seduced by the idea that I am incapable of conceptual error? Am I stupid or vain enough to assert that some stroke of fate gave me the qualities it denied to others, namely, not to err? Anyone who is familiar with my writings knows that I am neither vain nor stupid enough to proclaim such arrogance. He knows that ever since I called myself a natural scientist, I have belonged among those who, at the risk of their lives, fiercely struggle against any kind of so-called God-given facts and flawlessness. I consider the arrogant pretense of a Russian proletarian despot to omniscience and omnipotence just as sick and harmful as I do the Pope's arrogance in proclaiming himself as the all-knowing, infallible representative of God. I am doing this from my scientific viewpoint, which blames neither the German nor the Russian nor the Catholic father of all peoples, but solely the character structure of the human animal. As I have often explained, the root of misery should not be sought in the intentions or cruelties or arrogance of individual persons but in the biology of the human animal. Human animals alone are responsible, I have proclaimed time and again, contrary to all public opinion. I know human erring from my own experience. I, too, have joined in shouting guilty. Guilty. It is helpful to refer to the schema here in order to demonstrate this erring. I began to err when I held religion alone responsible for human suffering. I did not know that the error of religion was a symptom, not the cause, of human biopathy. I persisted in my error when I held the personal interests of a social group, parents or educators, responsible for suppressing human love life. I did not know that the suppression of love life is no more than a mechanism, and by no means the final cause, let alone intention, of certain social circles. When I was under the spell of the great socialist movement and worked for years, as a physician, among the underprivileged strata of the people, I fell into the gross error of thinking that the capitalist was responsible for human plight. It took the brutal experience of the deteriorating Russian Revolution to free me from this error. They had killed the capitalists, but misery continued to grow. Diplomatic intrigues, political maneuvering, spying, and informing on others, all of which they had set out to eradicate, were more powerfully at work than ever. These experiences inflicted deep wounds. For years, and in harmony with Freud's doctrine, I committed the error of thinking that the unconscious was evil and responsible for all misery. It took a full decade of hard, clinical work among the emotionally ill to free me from this error. This earned me the bitter enmity of many psychiatric businessmen, who enriched themselves at the expense of human emotional misery. Thus I committed the gravest errors of my time and even defended them with conviction. But I do claim for myself that I did not cling to them, as did so many of my co-workers and professional colleagues. I have remained mobile. Whether I am now falling into a new error, I do not know. I assume that it is correct to trace human distress to the pathology of human structure, which in turn lies in its armoring, and to hold the armoring responsible for the orgastic impotence of the human animal, but all this may be a mere mechanism. The answer lies somewhere in that area of our existence which has been so heavily obscured by organized religion and put out of our reach. Hence, it probably lies in the relation of the human being to the cosmic energy that governs him. But even if I continue to make errors, I try to find their sources. By and large this can be done. And while I am not at all prepared to go along with human viewpoints that have been proved wrong, I am eminently capable of accepting corrections of my errors and assimilating them into my thinking. I have proved this. I no longer believe, as I once did, that the overall guilt rests in the evil will of the first domain, or in the evil unconscious drives of the second, or in the evil capitalist of the third, or in the fixed hereditary traits of the fourth, or in the sin against the Holy Ghost of the fifth domain. There is no guilt at all, but merely an uncomprehended catastrophe in the biosocial development of the human animal. His biological armoring stands out as the central mechanism of his failure, but not as its cause. Aside from the known mechanism and the known consequences, the armoring, too, must have a comprehensible origin. From now on, we shall seek the origin of the tendency to err in the armoring of the human animal. This armoring is the only known function in man that is characterized by immobility. It works against the mobility of living functions and originated as an inhibiting mechanism. The immobility that strikes us as the hallmark of all human errors, the static, the absolute, the immovable, the eternal, might very well be an expression of human armoring. We could accept this conclusion only if the essential traits of human error were identical with the essential traits of the armoring, well known from clinical observations. We would thus have gained part of a secure foundation from which to judge our scientific perspective. We would clearly differentiate between the life expressions of the human animal, i.e., its motility and its armoring, and the resultant blocking. The thought technique underlying this process presupposes that the human animal cannot think, postulate, or do anything that is not somehow rooted in his biopsychic structure. According to this viewpoint, the biopsychic apparatus of man is the medium through which all inner and outer functions have to pass before they become thoughts or acts. To put it differently, man can think or do nothing, no matter how incorrect from the viewpoint of his own life or from the objective insight of nature, that does not somehow, somewhere, contain a nucleus of objective truth, in other words, that would not be meaningful or rational in some respect or other. Consequently, even the grossest human errors, such as the belief in supernatural spirits or in an absolute creator of all being, have a rational function and a comprehensible meaning. Even the guilt question and the absolute have a function corresponding to some reality. It is surprising to find that the human animal has proclaimed its two greatest idols, God and ether, to be virtually unknowable. One might also add the idea of mankind to these unknowables. Man has erred nowhere so gravely, so frequently, and so consistently as in the conceptual realms of God, ether, and man, although nothing else has occupied and stirred him as much as these three ideas. He has failed in all three realms and found no practical support in them. Since we presuppose that the ideas of God, ether, and man are rooted in a reality, it follows logically that the armoring of the human animal must be responsible for his thinking in a vacuum in all three areas. Evidently, he perceives reality as in a mirror, without ever touching it. Let us dare a further assumption: the conceptual worlds of God and ether show so many similarities that they must have a common origin, regardless of the fact that God as an aesthetic quality and ether as a physical quantity so far have never met, and could not meet within the framework of human thought. There is no bridge between God and ether in the thinking of the human animal, just as there is no bridge between the beauty of a color and its corresponding frequency of oscillations, vibrations, in the ether. It seems all the more peculiar and significant because God and ether have so many similarities in the world of human imagination. The physical reality underlying the concepts of God and ether might be the primal cosmic energy, argon energy. And the motives that so far have prevented the human animal from finding and describing God as well as ether practically might be the same as those that have prevented it from discovering cosmic argon energy. Following this assumption, if the living, dynamic element in the human animal perceived cosmic argon energy, metaphysically as God and physically as ether, his armoring prevented him from putting his perceptions to scientific and practicable, technical use. This is the wide framework of thought in which the theme of this book will be elaborated. The following functional diagram will show these assumed relations. Proof of their actual reality will take us far into the realm of nature. Diagram of the functional relations between God, ether, and argon energy, framework of the conceptual technique of this book. Chapter 3 Organ sensation as a tool of natural research. Pleasure, longing, anxiety, rage, sadness, roughly in that order, are the basic emotions of life. They are predicated on the completely free motility of the organism. Each of these emotions has its own particular quality. They all express a modal condition of the organism, which has a significance, psychologically, a meaning, in relation to the self and the world at large. This significance is rational. It corresponds to real conditions and modal processes of the protoplasm. The primary emotions of life also have a rational function. The function of pleasure leads to the discharge of surplus cell energy. Anxiety is at the base of every reaction of rage. And in the realm of life, rage has the overall function of conquering or eliminating life-threatening situations. Sadness expresses the loss of familiar contact, and longing expresses the desire for contact with another organotic system. We shall have to show later that it is the function of emotion that constitutes the goal of a drive, and not the reverse, as the metaphysicians postulate. Here, we merely intended to demonstrate that primary emotions are, and must be, rational if life is to function meaningfully. This is proven by its existence. I emphasize the rationality of primary emotions of the living because the mechanists of depth psychology have managed to spread the opinion that all emotions spring from drives and are therefore irrational. This mistaken belief, so catastrophic for the well-being of life, has its irrational function and its origin in a character structure whose rationality will have to be closely examined. The primary, rational, and the secondary, irrational, emotions were found mixed together and people did not have the courage or insight to separate them. This confusion was responsible for much of the tragedy of the human animal. In order to have a complete biological understanding of this tragedy, we will have to learn far more about the function and expression of life in its natural state. The emotions are specific functions of the living protoplasm. Living nature, in contrast to the non-living, responds to stimuli with movement, or motion equals emotion. It necessarily follows, from the functional identity of emotion and plasmatic movement, that even the most primitive flakes of protoplasm have sensations. The sensations can be understood directly from the responses to stimuli. These responses of plasmatic flakes do not differ in any way from those of highly developed organisms. There are no lines to be drawn here. If our impressions of the movements of life correctly reflect their expression, if the basic functions of life are identical in all living matter, if sensations arise from emotions, and if emotions spring from real plasmatic movements, then our impressions must be objectively correct, provided, of course, that our sensory apparatus is neither fragmented nor armored nor otherwise disturbed. Non-living matter does not feel because it is without pulsatory movement. Be it a rock or a cadaver, it conveys the immediate impression of immobility, and with it a lack of sensation. This lack of response to stimuli is in complete accord with our impressions of inanimate matter. Non-living matter has no emotions, i.e., no spontaneous movements. We will later have to go into the question of why so many human organisms animate the inanimate, thereby attributing sensations to it. I anticipate the principal conclusion: just as all emotions and reactions in life spring from and correspond to organ sensations and expressive movements, just as the living organism forms ideas of its surrounding world from impressions it derives from the expressions of the world around it, so all emotions, reactions, and ideas of the armored organism are conditioned by its own state of motility and expression. The objective critical standpoint, which asserts that all perceptions of the surrounding world are subjective, both in the unarmored and in the armored organism, and therefore unobjective, can be refuted by the image of an object in two different mirrors. One mirror is clear, the other has a scratched surface. The first mirror reflects the objects differently from the second. In both cases the reflection, i.e., the sensation, is subjective or arbitrary. The images of the objects in both mirrors are unreal. Yet no one can doubt that the smooth mirror will reflect the objects as they are, while the marred mirror will distort them. I have chosen this example to show that my opponents, both the exponents of absolute objective science and the critical subjectivists, are completely correct in asserting that we have merely sensations and perceptions of the reality around us, that sensation is the only access by which the living organism is connected to the surrounding world, that we do not perceive the object itself but only its image. This is all well and good, but becomes obsessional brooding unless we think further. From the standpoint of argon biophysics, we even welcome the fact that our objectivists and subjectivists emphasize all emotional activity as being dependent on the structure of the life apparatus. It will be shown that our objectivists, the objective natural scientists, are subjectivists, and that the subjectivists are objective observers, without knowing or even guessing it. Both claim they experience merely sensations when they describe the world. But neither asks about the nature of the sensations or, rather, about the structure of the perceiving life apparatus. Argon biophysics has given a clear answer to this. The unarmored being perceives the self and the surrounding world in an essentially different way than does the armored organism. Since self-awareness actually colors all other sensations, and since sensation is the filter through which the world becomes manifest to us, the kind of sensations determines the kind of perception and judgments. This conclusion is indispensable and irrefutable. It applies to the unarmored being as well as to the armored, to myself as well as to my opponents, the objectivist and the subjectivist. It applies rigorously, and I am willing to abide by these terms of the debate, because the standpoint of my opponents, if fully worked through, leads to the safeguarding of functionalism, and not of mechanistics or mysticism. My position has always been that everyone is right in some way, without knowing in what way he is right. Thus, for future reflections, we affirm the following: the living organism perceives its environment and itself only through its sensations. On the kind of sensations depends the kind of judgments developed, the reactions based on these judgments, and the overall picture commonly known as world image. I did not, and do not, intend to fabricate world images. But my work and I were so often endangered by them that a closer study of their functions and foundations is in order. The educator who thinks functionally regards the child as a living organism and shapes the environment of the child according to its vital needs. The educator whose thinking is mechanistic and mystical regards the child as a mechanistic chemical machine, as a subject of the state or as an adherent of this or that religion. He presses the child into an alien world and calls this adaptation, if he is a liberal, or discipline, if he is an authoritarian. That which is alive in the child obeys cosmic laws and therefore has not changed in thousands of years. It develops new meanings and contents of life from its own resources. But the adaptation to changeable life forms of mechanistic religious civilization creates the chaos of contradictions in which the human animal finds itself trapped. If Columbus had been a mechanistic compulsive character, he would have prepared his global circumnavigation by counting all the nails in his ship and entering them in neat columns. If, in spite of this, he had somehow reached America, he would have started the colonization by measuring the coastal stretch where he landed, by counting and measuring all trees, branches, twigs, and leaves, by classifying all brooks and rivers and hills. Lost in minor details, he would have perished long before he could return to Europe to reveal his discovery of a new continent. Our mechanistic mystical civilization is doomed because it has filmed and classified millions of minute statistical data about the movements of a newborn infant, but it still pays no heed to the biosexuality of the living organism we call child, nor to the bitter hatred that educators feel about this general fact, which looms above all others. Thus the educational question is enmeshed in details, without perspective, hopelessly snarled. The recognition of the child as a living being, instead of a future citizen, would solve all complications with one stroke, because institutions would be concerned with the vital needs of the child. Therefore, the only way out of this chaos is to shape the life forms according to the laws of the living organism. This task requires clarification about the two basically different attitudes toward life, that of the unarmored and that of the armored organism. From now on we shall operate with these two essentially different forms of life. One is the living organism that operates, undisturbed, on the basis of natural processes. The other is the living organism whose plasmatic functions are impeded by chronic and autonomous armoring. We expect, for good reasons, that the perceptions of the two forms are clearly distinguishable. The unarmored organism has basically different sensory perceptions from the armored one. Since the body plasma is the receiver and transmitter of all impressions, a free-flowing plasmatic system must receive impressions that differ from the unfree, or armored one. These are not philosophical speculations about sensation and cosmos but hard facts, collected with great effort during many hours of daily work with the human organism, collected, organized, re-examined and finally judged in the course of more than a quarter of a century. The facts spring from concrete observations of human behavior. The armored organism does not feel any plasmatic current, in sharp contrast to the unarmored organism. To the same degree to which the armoring is loosened, sensations of current, which the armored organism first experiences as anxiety, appear. Once the armoring is completely dissolved, argonautic currents are experienced as pleasure. Thereby all reactions are so basically changed that we may speak of two entirely alien and essentially disparate biological conditions. Of course, this change does not occur in every instance, but where it succeeds, it parallels fundamental changes of organ sensations, and with the organ sensations, the entire view of life changes rapidly and radically. The argon therapist is not concerned with philosophical reflections about the world and life. Neither the physician nor the teacher, neither the patient nor the pupil broods about the individual's attitude toward society and cosmos. I deliberately stress the clinical character of these experiences. For there are character structures that will kill off anything and everything with such phrases as, well, these are merely philosophical questions. The one may be just as accurate or inaccurate as the other. There are several truths about one and the same fact. This position is untenable. There can be only one explanation about one and the same fact that is objectively accurate, there cannot be 10 different correct explanations. The question about the energy source of biopathies admits only one answer, and not 10. The energy of biopathic reactions stems from dammed up biological sexual energy. There may be several strata or phases in the development of a biopathy, different functions and aspects. There may be various ways that lead to this one answer. However, there is also a common feature, the basic function of energy stasis. The details may vary, depending on special social situations or childhood experiences. But what consolidates all these details, no matter how much they may differ, and is expressed basically as the biopathic deviation of the life function are invariably the stasis of biological, biosexual, energy and the armoring. In the long run, no medical science, all efforts to the contrary, will be able to evade this inescapable conclusion. In my book Character Analysis, I have distinguished between two basic types, the genital and the neurotic character, with respect to biophysical health. The fundamental difference between them is the absence or presence of a chronic sexual stasis and the autonomous armoring. The importance of this clinical distinction far transcends the individual. It deeply influences all forms of life attitudes and world images. The reader will no doubt have realized that what is alive in the genital character functions according to its own natural laws, while in the neurotic character it functions according to laws that correspond to the armored, and not to the living, process. A healthy snake moves and acts according to the laws of cosmic argon energy. A snake whose body is roped up acts, perceives and responds on the basis of movements hindered by the rope. This example can be generalized. The unarmored living organism perceives and understands the modal expressions of other unarmored organisms clearly and plainly by means of its own spontaneous movements and organ sensations. The armored living organism, however, cannot feel any organ sensations, or perceives them only in distorted form and therefore loses contact with the living process and the understanding of its functions. For instance, an armored person may perceive his rigid, protruding chest as an expression of toughness. Within his own life experience, this perception is correct. The military bearing of his chest does serve to keep his equilibrium, giving him strength in the daily struggle for existence. However, he has no idea how his natural life forces are weakened by the armoring of the chest. Furthermore, he does not understand that one can react freely and strongly with a flexible rib cage. He regards a flexible rib cage as a sign of effeminacy and weakness. He fears he cannot exist unless he holds on to himself, instead of yielding. He is unaware of the natural strength flowing from the free motility of the living organism. In turn, the living organism which is unarmored cannot understand how any strength can derive from a rigid rib cage. If it tries for a while to imitate the controlled strength of character by stopping its breath and thrusting out the rib cage, it feels only a giant effort that it cannot sustain for long. The unarmored organism cannot comprehend how the effort of the armoring can be tolerated for years on end. What is alive in the healthy argon therapist understands or experiences the expression of the armored patient as an effect of contrast, as it were, something alien and disturbing. He perceives the stiff rib cage or the rigid, mask-like grin as embarrassing and disturbing. The armored person is different. To him, the rigid rib cage and the frozen smile have become second nature. He perceives them neither as a disturbance nor as the strain that they actually are. He does not even know that he is constantly on guard with his rib cage, and that his chronic grin represses tears or rage. In contradistinction, the unarmored organism perceives the fixed friendly grin for what it is, namely, an embarrassing burden to be shed as soon as possible. Thus, the unarmored organism experiences the armoring of another organism as disturbing. By the same token, the armored organism feels the free motility of another being as alien and disturbing. In many cases, it causes conscious anxiety, and in all cases of armoring we find a deep-seated dread of free motility. Once it is loosened sufficiently, every case of biopathy shows a mortal fear of the free-moving organism. Anyone who applies the undiluted technique of argon therapy, i.e., with the orgasm theory at its core, can convince himself that this claim is correct. Our contention that the attitude toward life, the world image, depends on the functioning of body plasma is unequivocally proved once we have enabled a large number of armored organisms to experience the flow of their argonatic current. We are today in the fortunate position to give an accounting of this tool of natural research. Basically, nature inside and outside of us is accessible to our intellect only through our sense impressions. The sense impressions are essentially organ sensations, or, to put it differently, we grope for the world around us by organ movements, equals plasmatic movements. Our emotions are the answer to the impression of the world around us. Both in awareness and self-awareness, sensory impression and emotion merge to form a functional unity. Hence, organ sensation is the most important tool of natural scientific research. This specific claim is further affirmed by the investigations of classical natural philosophy. It asserts, with particular clarity in Kant's critique of pure reason, that the true nature of things is not accessible to us. Observations and judgments depend on our physical organization. And, until recently, this organization was the least accessible area of nature. Therefore, the inability to recognize das Ding and sich is based, in principle, on the inability to recognize the nature of the sensory apparatus. For argon biophysics, an extremely important conclusion follows from this accurate presupposition of the critique of pure reason. If we succeeded in comprehending the function of perception and of sensation per se in energetic terms, argonautically, i.e., by studying its true nature, we would create an access to das Ding and sich. In Freud's research, it was the unconscious that played the role of das Ding and sich in the psychic organization and thus became the instrument of natural research. The discovery of argon energy was made through consistent, thorough study of energy functions, first in the realm of the psyche, and later in the realm of biological functioning. The material of this research was organ sensation. It is an integral part of our ego perception as well as a part of objectively functioning nature. In argonautic functioning, we perceive ourselves. Self-perception is objectively and experimentally controllable, If the subject of the experiment has keen organ sensations, he can, by their intensity, describe what goes on in the next room in terms of the quantitative potential fluctuations on the oscillograph. Likewise, the observer at the oscillograph can tell, by the quantity of energy variations, how intensely the subject of the experiment feels his organ sensations. 1. This removed the barrier that for thousands of years had hindered the investigation of organ sensation. X-ray photography showing the energy field of the hands was the result of the conceptual unification of sensory perception and objective excitation. 2. The energy field shows no shadows if the sensation of attraction is absent. By closely studying the organ sensations, we become familiar with the tool we use in every kind of natural research, consciously or unconsciously, correctly or inefficiently. In this way, the organization and functioning of the living organism become the most important and indispensable preconditions of scientific knowledge in general. This harmonizes with Kant's critique of reason, which places the biological organization at the root of all knowledge. Lang drew the right conclusion early. Perhaps, he wrote in his History of Materialism, the basis for the causality concept will someday be found in the mechanism of the reflex movement and in sympathetic excitation. Then we would have translated Kant's pure reason into physiology and hence made it more graphic. Lang, Materialism, Volume 2, p. 44, 1902. Lang's grand prediction is now fulfilled. Argon biophysics operates with organ sensations as a first sense of a strictly physiological nature. In order to investigate nature, we must literally love the object of our investigation. In the language of Argon biophysics, we must have direct and undisturbed argonotic contact with the object of our investigation. The dynamics of argonotic body functions is revealed in argon therapy. In this manner we learn about the mechanisms at the root of the various life attitudes, Weltanschauungen. I could write a ponderous tome on the numerous armoring mechanisms to explain the mystic, the politician, the criminal, the tactician, etc. This is not the objective of this book. We must limit ourselves to the basic mechanisms that distinguish the truly alive organism from its distorted form of expression in the biopathy. Furthermore, we have to confront these two alien worlds and penetrate to the social tragedies that have afflicted the human animal for thousands of years, ever since his organism became armored. In its own realm, the unarmored organism develops an infinite variety of life forms. The same is true for the armored organism, which develops an equally infinite variety of biopathic reactions. We are interested in the type as a whole, in the contradictory life sensations from which all other contradictions derive. The armored organism is essentially different from the unarmored one in that a rigid wall is erected between its biological core, from which all natural impulses stem, and the world in which it lives and works. As a result, every natural impulse, particularly the natural function of and capacity for love, is impeded. The living core of the armored organism has retained its impulses, but they can no longer find free expression. In the desperate attempt to express itself, every natural impulse is forced to penetrate or break through the wall of the armoring. The impulse must use force to reach the surface and the goal. While the impulse is trying to overcome the armoring by force, it is transformed into a destructive rage, regardless of its original nature. It does not matter what happens to this secondary rage reaction later, after passing through the armor, whether it spends itself or is inhibited, whether it turns into morbid self-pity or reaches its goal as undisguised sadism. The core of the process is the transformation of all love impulses into destructiveness while passing through the armor. To repeat, it is the effort to express itself naturally and reach its goal that converts every basic biological impulse into destructiveness. In the process, the total being of the armored person acquires a characteristic that can only be described as hardness or disharmony. The diagram of this process is as follows: the existence of the armor does not prevent the stricken organism from loving or being afraid. Its life expressions spring from all depth strata of the organism. It communicates with the world as if through gaps or holes in the armor. But since it cannot fully let itself go, its love is small, carefully measured and allotted, its concern for the child is controlled, Taking all circumstances into account, its accomplishment is well measured and reasoned, pointing toward meaningful and purposeful work. Its hatred is goal-oriented and circumscribed. Briefly, it never loses its head, is always reasonable and composed, the way a realistic politician has to be. Such an organism hates the well-ordered but infinitely variable freedom of natural processes, or it fears them. Its destructive hatred is directed mainly, we would not exaggerate if we said, exclusively against all genuine and unrestrained attitudes of the unarmored organism, against the spontaneous, pleasurable, enthusiastic, vibrating, wild and foolish things in life. Above all, it opposes what is involuntary and free in the body. In its destructive attitude toward the alive or unarmored organism, the armored organism knows no mercy. Here it loses the qualities it has otherwise raised to the level of ideal human behavior. In the guise of idealistic or hygienic attitudes, the armored organism knows how to kill every spontaneous impulse in itself and other organisms. One should carefully read the following piece of advice, printed in a widely read New York newspaper in 1945. The author has realized the importance of proper breathing. She knows of the harm done by poor breathing. She wants to correct and help, but what a regimen of you may and you must not is unfolded. Deep breathing exercises. The effects of deep breathing are as varied as they are beneficial. The blood is purified, the complexion improved, and adequate assimilation of food is aided when we breathe correctly. There are some valuable exercises which improve posture, promote the health of internal organs, and encourage correct breathing habits. You may want to add these to your daily routine. Number 1, lie on the floor, on your back. Place your right hand on your diaphragm. Inhale slowly and deeply. As you inhale, your diaphragm and abdominal wall should move upward toward the ceiling. As you exhale, the area under your hand should return to normal position. Then contract abdominal muscles and pull in, and at the same time, flatten your back against the floor, touching as much of it as possible to the floor. Number 2, remain in the same position. Inhale deeply and bend your knees, placing your feet flat on the floor. Begin inhalation at the diaphragm so you feel the ribs spread sideways. Do not lift your upper chest, however. Exhale by drawing your abdominal muscles in and up, but do not allow ribs to collapse. Take another breath and exhale. Now take a series of little breaths, one right after the other. Exhale in a series of small exhalations by contracting the abdominal muscles in quick exhalations. Complete by entirely exhaling and collapsing the rib cage. This person recommends precisely what our armored patient tries to do in a biopathic manner when we ask him not to hold his breath. He does, exercises, demonstrates, acts, and performs breathing. But he does not breathe according to natural innervation. We can safely apply this example to all life expressions of the armored organism. Its nature invariably consists in evading and impeding the spontaneous, direct expression. In all other life situations the armored person may be tolerant, even charming, friendly, and helpful. He only becomes stubbornly angry when he sees the living organism functioning without armor. The destructiveness of armored life against unarmored life may be observed in the relations of most educators toward newborn children. The newborn infant comes into the world without armor. Life functions in him without regard for the demands of culture. His first utterance activates his organotically highly charged mouth. In our highly reputable obstetrical hospitals, infants, during their first 24 to 48 hours, are not breastfed by their mothers, according to some iron law. It takes a threat to move a nurse or a physician to break this rule. The infants suffer and whimper. Culture has no ear for that. One might ask about the reason for this procedure. There is no reasonable answer, or at best one of those stereotyped replies that might come from a masked mouth. Newborn infants feel the touch of their mothers for only a few minutes during the day. Think of it, what an offense against the rules of hygiene. The infant, barely torn from the organotic contact with the warm uterus, which lasted for an uninterrupted 9 months, this infant, suddenly transferred from an environment of 37 degrees Celsius into one of 18 or 20 degrees C, may not feel the mother's body. This violates the rules of hospital administration, culture, and morality. It provokes the Oedipus complex, offends customs and mores, opposes the lifestyle of the highest of all branches of medicine, represented by the academies of science, honorary doctors, and honorary presidents of all universities of this universe, in which electrons and protons, side by side with neutrons and positrons, dance the St. Vitus dance of atomic explosion. It is here, precisely here, and not at diplomatic conferences or anywhere else, that infants acquire their future readiness to make war. The newborn child reacts to the cold first with anxiety, then with screams, and finally with a contraction of his autonomic system, the first contraction of his life, unless a lifeless uterus has damaged his organism beforehand. This massacre of the newborn, plainly audible in the ear-splitting and heartbreaking screams in all the infant rooms of all obstetrical clinics the world over, this massacre, as I said, has nothing to do with hygienic considerations. It is the first unconscious but drastic measure by armored organisms in the guise of physicians, administrators, and parents against the living organism that confronts them, unspoiled and undisturbed. Let us ponder this fact. Thousands of doctors and nurses hear the screaming infants and understand nothing. They remain deaf and dumb. Add to this the ritual of covered mouths and rubber-clad hands to understand the shifting of all emphasis, the evasion of the essential, and the stress on the unessential, which are used in this battle against the newborn child. I insist that prevailing medicine and pedagogy, as they are officially taught and practiced, do not understand the living organism and do not have the vaguest idea about the most primitive life processes. I speak of life processes, and not of the number of red blood corpuscles. This confirms my rigorous dictum that the organism can perceive only what it itself expresses. The armored physician cannot hear the screams of the infants, or else he takes them for granted because he has stifled the screams inside himself, and because his own organism can no longer perceive what another organism reveals to him. There are only a few, courageous islands of inchoate understanding. I do not intend to write a compendium of the massacre committed in the upbringing of the child. This must be left to others who are more competent than I am. First of all, the common denominator of its many variations must be brought to light. I do not doubt the good intentions of doctors, nurses, educators, and parents. I do assert, however, that their deep-seated love for the newborn cannot be translated into practical action. They do not understand the living function in the newborn, more than that, they fear it as dangerous and alien. Psychoanalytic pedagogy has openly proclaimed the killing of the animal in the child. This attitude deserves sharpest condemnation and the revelation of the motives behind it. Loss of contact with the maternal organism is the first step in the following sequence, impeding of any kind of motor activity, a mere few years ago in the form of actually binding limbs and torso by swaddling, forcing the infant to breathe through the nose instead of breathing naturally through the slightly opened mouth, rigid upbringing to suppress crying and screaming, regulation of the bowel movements and forced toilet training with suppositories and enemas by compulsive mothers. Prevention of all spontaneous sexual expressions, especially masturbation. Armored life encounters unarmored life with anxiety and hatred. In many cases, the anxiety turns into shock, and the hatred into bloodthirsty, murderous, and blindly raging terror. The armored organism cannot bear the soft, yielding movements of a newborn child. Anyone who has ever held a bird in his hand knows the feeling I mean. It is not easy to understand why the language of our educators is so sharp, their demands so stern, their tone so harsh, their punishments so calculated to humiliate. In the conceptual realm of present-day culture we find no satisfactory explanation that sheds any light on this rough treatment of children. There are no plausible reasons that explain why the ideal teacher is still the elderly, gaunt, ugly, virginal spinster. Celibacy for teachers is still practiced in many countries, and where it is not mandatory it is tacitly expected. It has long been known that the sexually unsatisfied organism experiences natural life expressions as a provocation. It is known that such a person does not like to be reminded of his unhappiness, of his frustration. But it is not that simple. The armored organism does not initially hate the truly alive, unarmored organism. On the contrary, he tries to establish contact and reacts first in a rational, loving manner. But the course of the love relationship invariably and compulsively turns to furious hatred. Close examination of the process shows that the armored organism either cannot fully establish contact or cannot maintain it. Sooner or later the warm, loving impulse is blocked by the armor. This is followed by the tormenting feeling of frustration. The armored organism does not know that its love impulses have been blocked, and behaves as if the unarmored organism had denied it love. In its desperate attempt to break through and express its love, the love impulse turns into hatred and destructiveness. This hatred is not willed, not consciously reasoned. The reason for the hatred is always dragged in as a byproduct, thus becoming a rationalization. The mechanism just described has general importance. Without recognizing it, so much of human interaction, which otherwise would be incomprehensible, can be understood. In another context, I will discuss the lawfulness of this sudden turn from rapture and love to bitter hatred. It is always the inability of the armored organism to develop its love impulses, to generate enthusiasm, to commit itself without reservation to a cause that makes it destructive. In addition, there is the attitude of the unarmored child toward the armored educator. Healthy children are extremely sensitive to simulated forms of behavior. They turn away from armored people and reach out to those who are unarmored. In the presence of an armored organism, the unarmored person very soon feels hemmed in, without contact, rejected. We are not yet able to read reactions accurately with the use of instruments, but there can be no doubt about the biophysical nature of these reactions. We are dealing with contact phenomena, with excitations of the argon field. The contact between two unarmored organisms, say, between a healthy mother and a healthy child, is completely different. There is nothing forced about body expressions. Love attitudes are just as rational in their foundation and expression as are defensive mechanisms or hatred. Contrary to the complicated and tangled conflicts in the relationship between two armored organisms, healthy human intercourse is simple. It is not without friction, but there are no biopathic reactions of neurotic stickiness, petty vindictiveness, or insoluble complexities. It is precisely the simplicity in human intercourse that is so incomprehensible to the armored organism. Everything natural and profound is simple. The simple, grand lines of emotional expression are known to characterize the great painter, musician, poet, novelist, and scientist. But the simple is alien to the armored organism. Its impulses are so complicated in their form of expression, the manner of their utterance is so muddled and contradictory that it has no organ for the simple and unequivocal emotional expression. It even lacks a sense of simplicity. Its love is mixed with hatred and anxiety. The unarmored organism loves unequivocally in love situations, hates unequivocally where hatred is legitimate, and fears unequivocally where fear is rational. The armored organism hates where it should love, loves where it should hate, and is frightened where it should love or hate. Complexity is the specific life expression of the armored person. He is trapped, as it were, in the multiple contradictions of his existence. Since he approaches all experiences with his complex character structure, his experiences become equally complicated. He is amazed at the accomplishments of the healthy organism, or he places these accomplishments in the area of special talent barred to him. Genius becomes a kind of abnormal monster, because he cannot understand the great simplicity in the life expression of genius. In the consistent stripping away of the layers of character, one discovers that complexity epitomizes the defensive mechanism in its purest form. The armored person is complicated because he has a mortal terror of everything simple, straightforward, and direct. I say, mortal terror. This is no literary exaggeration. The word accurately describes the process. The simple, straightforward, direct expression inescapably leads periodically to orgastic plasma convulsions. The armored person cannot express himself with immediacy because his natural impulses are distorted, fragmented, inhibited, and transformed in the tangled net of his character structure. The armored person perceives himself and the world as complicated because he has no immediate contact, no straightforward relationship to the world around him. The secondary result is that over the years this world becomes actually complicated. Since these complications make an ordered existence impossible, artificial rules in human intercourse emerge, rigid mores, customs, rules of etiquette, diplomatic maneuvers. No unarmored person would have the impulse to vomit or pass wind in the presence of others. Hence it would never occur to him to advise or demand obedience to the rules of society that one must not vomit in the presence of others or yield to flatulence. The armored person, however, is full of such impulses. It is from his own source of secondary drives that he derives the rules and ethical customs against them. The nature and intensity of a social secondary impulses in man can be directly established by the number and strength of societal mores and rules of conduct. The unarmored organism does not know the impulse to rape or murder young girls, to experience pleasure by violence, etc. It is therefore indifferent toward moral rules designed to hold these impulses in check. It finds it inconceivable to have sexual intercourse solely because there is an opportunity, such as being alone in a room with a person of the opposite sex. The armored person, on the other hand, cannot imagine an orderly life without rigid compulsory laws against rape and sex murder. He is incapable of understanding that a man and woman can be alone without sexual intimacy. Briefly, he is full of perversions, and therefore the world appears to him as one vast perverse temptation. For a long time, psychoanalysis had to suffer from this perversion of the perverse as it raged against the physician and the female patient being alone in a room. Even today, sex economy is regarded as a doctrine of sexual orgies among perverse and armored persons. A heavily armored sadist who came to me for help was enthusiastic about my writings because I had, so he said, completely set free the indiscriminate fucking of everybody with everybody else. After several weeks of hard work, he knew better. I have no control over the many perverts and sadists who read my books and pass off their dirty fantasies as my doctrine. He who fights the plague must reckon with the possibility of becoming infected himself. The pornographic interpretation of sex economy is the infectious disease of our profession. In time, we will convince ourselves that this pornographic infection is not limited to the circle of pornographers and perverts. Extremely honorable groups contain equally dangerous carriers of the emotional plague. One of the objectives of this book is to distinguish sharply the healthy from the sick life, to implant their contradictions into human consciousness and thus protect the physician who fights the emotional plague from such dangerous contamination. Sadistic brutality, pornographic lewdness, and rejection filled with mortal terror are thus the external manifestations of the impulses after they have passed through the character armor. Since the majority of human animals are armored, it is not surprising that sex economy and, later, argon biophysics ran into a roadblock of brutality, pornography, and mortal terror after they had made some simple, directly understandable disclosures concerning the core of the life process. If the responsibility for separating natural life impulses from the sadistic pornography of the general public were not so enormous, I would have declined any controversy with those on a giant garbage heap of emotional filth. As it is, I could not withdraw into the comfortable academic viewpoint of splendid isolation. There is too much at stake. And while not motivated by vindictiveness, I cannot deny myself the triumph of having escaped unbroken and untainted, from this truly Dantesque inferno of human existence, even though badly scarred by painful and dangerous insults to my sense of dignity and awareness of my scientific accomplishment by the outrageous slander of biopathic individuals. From now on we shall trace the unarmored living organism from its origins in the cosmic argon ocean. And we shall follow the armored organism on its grotesque and perilous road. We will separate these two basic forms of life and see them collide only at specific places. This separation is artificial, and like everything artificial it is only a dead cross-section through living functions. We will leave important questions unanswered, and many doubts will remain. But, at the end, a law will be revealed that brings all organic functions in their infinite shapes and varieties into a unified, grand harmony of nature. Man's deviation from this law will be all the more painfully experienced. What I have grasped and described in medical language as the emotional plague of the human animal will strike us as even more terrible. It constitutes the vast disharmony in human nature, alien to the animal and the plant, the human infant, and the few human beings fortunate or strong enough to escape it. In describing the deadly struggle between unarmored and armored life, I can report only on those cases I experienced personally or as a physician with my patients. In doing so, the limits between orthodox biology and sociology tend to blur. Man as a social being is only a specific variant of his natural existence. In the light of the harmonious process of life, the raging of the emotional plague in social life will reveal itself glaringly. We will have to transcend the realm of our social thinking and look at it from the standpoint of the living process in man in order to gain distance and perspective. We will have to assess the great tragedy that befell the human animal when it viewed what is alive in itself, its worst enemy. We will experience its hatred of the living. But only if we look upon the social realm of functioning from the standpoint of the living process will it be possible to condemn not plague-stricken man but the circumstances that degraded him into the most malevolent of all animals. We are setting out on a long and arduous journey. Those who do not want to come along or who expect the usual platitudes about biology and sociology should stay home. But those who have the courage to face some hard truths are welcome to join us. Chapter 4 Animism, Mysticism, and Mechanistics. We must ask, was ignorance about the living process merely the result of a faulty conceptual technique and insufficient research? Or was it the result of a characterological inhibition, an unconscious intention, as it were? The history of science leaves no doubt that the living process was not allowed to be studied, that through thousands of years it was the mechanistic mystical structure of the human animal that excluded from all research, by absolutely all conceivable means, the cosmic foundations of the living process. And there was method to this structural intention, first, in the religious conceptual prohibition that presented God and life a priori as being unknowable, then, even in the punishment by death for recognizing the life process, as contained in several religious taboos. The myth of Adam and Eve has a deep rational meaning. To eat from the tree of knowledge meant to be expelled from paradise by fire and sword. It is a snake, a symbol of the phallus as well as of primal biological motion, that persuades Eve to seduce Adam. They pluck the forbidden apple and eat it. They are overcome with shame. The sexual symbolism is self-evident. Whoever eats from the tree of knowledge perceives God and life, and this is punishable. Thus goes the legend. Awareness of the law of love leads to awareness of the law of life, which in turn leads to awareness of God. This sequence is true throughout every phase of the history of science and has been confirmed by the discovery of cosmic argon energy in the 20th century. The punishments that followed this discovery were entirely in keeping with the old biblical legend. It is not true that I was the first to observe argon energy and, with it, the functional law that merges organic and inorganic nature into one. In the course of 2 millennia of human history, people time and again encountered phenomena of argon energy, or they developed thought systems that approached the reality of cosmic argon energy. That these insights could not break through should be blamed on the same human character traits that created religious prohibitions and destroyed any progress in the right direction. Basically, the weapons of destruction were invariably either mechanistic, pseudoscientific counter-arguments or mystical obscurantism, except in cases of physical annihilation. I can only cite scattered examples from various epochs. A presentation of the systematic effort on the part of the emotional plague of mankind to destroy the functional equation of God equals life equals cosmic argon energy equals ergonomic functional law of nature equals law of gravitation must be left to historians. Even among the Greeks there existed a rigid and fanatical orthodoxy that rested just as much on the interests of an arrogant priesthood as it did on the faith of a multitude in need of redemption. This might have been forgotten altogether if Socrates had not been forced to drink the cup of poison, but Aristotle, too, escaped from Athens so that the city did not sin against philosophy a second time. Philosophy in antiquity played the role of today's natural science. R. Protagoras had to flee and his writings about the gods were burned by order of the state. Anaxagoras was imprisoned and had to flee. Theodorus the atheist and probably Diogenes of Apollonia were persecuted as atheists. And all this happened in humane Athens. From the standpoint of the multitude, everyone, even the most idealistic philosopher, could be persecuted as an atheist, for no one imagined the gods to be as priestly tradition dictated it. This was written by Friedrich Albert Lang in his History of Materialism. What was the basis for the ancient denial of the gods? What was there about the development of scientific materialism that enabled Greek philosophy to oppose superstition? It was the energy hypothesis of the soul atoms of Democritus, i.e., a scientific glimpse of the existence of a special energy, the argon, underlying the psychic functions. Materialistic philosophy did not start from mechanistic questions but, oddly enough, from basic psychological questions, just as argon biophysics sprang from the psychiatric problems of the biological drive dynamics. What is sensation? How can matter perceive itself? What is sensation tied to? Under what conditions does sensation exist, and under what conditions does it not? Thus, natural science of antiquity, brilliant and in its assessments accurately oriented to this day, did not start from material but from functional problems that did not exclude sensation. It was over these functional processes, and not over materialistic questions, that the scientific mind separated from the metaphysicians and the mystics. These were the questions that kindled the battle flames of the emotional plague against the knowledge of nature and the equation of God equals natural law. These questions and not, originally, the mechanistic laws governing the velocity of falling bodies turned the accurate world image and its processes into the burning issue they became. For every scientific mind realized that it was only our own sensation of the processes in us and outside us that contained the key to the deeper secrets of nature. The sensation of living protoplasm is a singular phenomenon of nature, within and not beyond human life. Sensation is the sieve through which the inner and outer stimuli are perceived. It forms the bridge between ego and outer world. This is an established fact, both among natural philosophers and natural scientists who are aware of their investigative methods. It is all the more strange that, until recently, scientific research was unable to say anything about this central part of its own nature and that mysticism could usurp the realm of life sensations with such completely disastrous effect. Such grotesque facts always have a certain function and a secret intention. It would of course be wrong to assume that sometime, somewhere, there was a secret council of armored human animals who determined how the knowledge of sensation itself, the link between ego and nature, could be prevented and why those who discovered the secret of nature should be so harshly punished, persecuted, burned, and tortured. There were no secret deliberations and there were no decrees. The deadly battle that the emotional plague waged against the recognition of the basis of sensation was dictated, guided, and carried out by the structural laws of armored human beings. It was the character analytic theory of structure that first broke the spell and opened the gate to insight into the nature of sensation itself. The ensuing discovery of biological energy phenomena within the perceiving organism and the further discovery of atmospheric argon energy in the purely physical sense were merely the logical consequences of the first act, the discovery that sensation is a function of excitation, that, in other words, there is a functional identity between the quantity of excitation and the intensity of sensation. With this, sensation itself had become the objective of scientific research. The further consequences of this discovery speak for themselves. Sensation is the function of a limiting membrane that separates the living system from the surrounding argon ocean. Through this membrane the argonautic living body communicates with all other argon systems. It is no accident that the sensory nerves develop from the ectoderm, the outer germinal layer of the gastrula. Since the physical view of nature results from the biological constitution of the observer of nature, the world image cannot be separated from the creator of the world image. Briefly, natural research that discovered the atom bomb is confronted with the natural research that discovered cosmic argon energy, sharply, clearly, and irreconcilably. It must be decided whether nature is an empty space with a few widely scattered specks or whether it is a space full of cosmic primordial energy, a continuum that functions dynamically and obeys a generally valid law of nature. The technician of physics, whose thinking was shaped by mechanistic philosophy, regards absolutely all physical problems as basically solved. His view of life is limited by the fact that sophisticated equipment enables airplanes to fly by remote control, so that the living pilot is eliminated. He believes that the invention of the most infamous murder weapon since time began is the dawn of a new era of atomic energy. His universe is crumbling under his feet, but his view of life is fixed and compact, consisting primarily of an empty space in which there are a few specks. We do not want to argue with him, although his opinion is an essential part in forming general public opinion. There is no room for the life process in this view. More than that, the practical effect of his view of nature is destructive, in theory, by omitting the living substance from all consideration, in practice, by social murder and war. It is different with the founders of this dead and deadly philosophy. The founders of this empty and dead universe are intelligent, educated men. They do not believe that all problems have been solved. On the contrary, they openly say that their physical image of the world is urgently in need of correction. They find themselves in contradiction with their own theory. In their own words, they have abandoned reality to withdraw into an ivory tower of mathematical symbols. They cannot be blamed for withdrawing from the real world into a shadow world and for operating with shadowy things and abstract symbols. Everyone can do, or not do, as he pleases, provided he harms no one. But does this kind of influence really harm no one? Is not the damage proved, since this kind of physics excluded the human being, mysticized life, and, intentionally or not, invariably returned to explosive substances because of its research orientation? I will try to describe the sensory apparatus of the mechanistic observer who has created mechanistic philosophy. How does it happen, we must ask, that mechanistic physics has been declared bankrupt by its most brilliant exponents but so far has failed to break through the iron walls of the thinking in which it is trapped? If we are consistent and hold the character structure of the physicist responsible for the mechanistic view of life, we must ask these questions: what is the nature of the mechanistic character structure? Which specific qualities underlie its helplessness in observing nature? Where does this character structure come from? And, finally, in which social processes did it originate? I am not obliged to present the history of mechanistic natural science. Suffice it for me to speak from experience and to describe the typical mechanistic physicist as he is revealed by psychiatric investigation. The typical mechanistic physicist thinks according to the principles of machine construction, which he primarily serves. A machine must be perfect. Hence the thought and action of the physicist must be perfect. Perfectionism is an essential characteristic of mechanistic thinking. It permits no errors. Uncertainties, situations in flux, are undesirable. The mechanist works with artificial models of nature when he experiments. The mechanistic experiment of the 20th century has lost the essential features of genuine investigation, the control and imitation of natural processes, which have characterized the work of all pioneers in the natural sciences. All machines of the same type are alike down to the most minute detail. Deviations are regarded as inaccuracies. In the realm of machine construction this is quite correct. But this principle will lead to error if applied to processes of nature. Nature is imprecise. Nature does not operate mechanically but functionally. Therefore, the mechanist always goes against nature whenever he uses his mechanistic principles. There is a lawful harmony of natural functions that permeates and governs all being. But this harmony and lawfulness is not the mechanical straitjacket that mechanistic man has imposed on his character and his civilization. Mechanistic civilization is a deviation from the law of nature. Even more, it is a perversion of nature, an extremely dangerous variant, just as a rabid dog represents a morbid variant within the species. In spite of the lawfulness of their functions, natural processes are characterized by the absence of any kind of perfectionism. In a naturally grown forest we find a uniform principle of growth. But there are no two trees and no two leaves among the hundreds of thousands of trees that resemble one another with photographic likeness. The realm of variations is infinitely wider than the realm of uniformity. Although the uniform law of nature can be found and functions in every single detail, no matter how small, there is nothing that can be reduced to perfectionism. With all their lawfulness, natural processes are uncertain. Perfectionism and uncertainty are mutually exclusive. One cannot object to this fact by pointing to the certainty of the functions of our solar system. True, for thousands of years the orbits of the planets around the Sun have not changed. But thousands, even millions, of years play only a minor role in the processes of nature. The origin of the planetary system is just as uncertain as its future. This is generally recognized. Thus, even the planetary system, this perfect mechanism of the astrophysicists, is imperfect, in the irregular fluctuations of thermal periods, sunspots, earthquakes, etc. Neither weather formation nor tidal flow and ebb functions according to the laws of machines. The failure of scientific mechanistics in these realms of nature is obvious, as is their dependence on the functions of a primordial cosmic energy. There is law in nature, that much is certain. But this law is not mechanistic. Therefore, perfectionism is a compulsive accuracy of mechanistic civilization, accurate within but not outside the realm of mechanistic functions, the artificial models of nature. Just as everything within the conceptual framework of formal logic is logical, but becomes illogical outside this framework, just as everything within the framework of abstract mathematics is consistent, but outside has no frame of reference, just as all principles operating in the authoritarian educational system are logical, but outside are useless and anti-educational, so, too, is mechanistic perfectionism outside its own logical domain unscientific, and, in its pseudo-accuracy, it functions as a drag upon natural investigation. Research without errors is impossible. All natural research is, and always was, groping, irregular, unstable, flexible, forever corrective, in flux, uncertain and insecure, and yet in contact with real processes. For these real processes, in spite of all their basic unifying laws, are variable in the highest degree, free in the sense of being irregular, unpredictable, and unrepeatable. It is precisely this freedom found in nature that frightens our mechanists when they encounter it. The mechanist cannot tolerate uncertainty. But this freedom is neither metaphysical nor mystical but functionally lawful. Here character analysis has opened up several crucial insights. It was important to apply psychiatric insights into human reactions, to the basically incomprehensible, hate-filled rejection of ergonomic phenomena. In my publications, I have dwelt time and again upon the astonishing fact that cosmic argon energy was so thoroughly and so consistently overlooked by the physicists. Lasting as it did for centuries, this oversight could not be an accident. My psychiatric work fortunately enabled me to unravel part of the mystery during the character analysis of an extremely gifted but inhibited physicist of the classic mechanistic school. We found that, rooted in certain experiences irrelevant in this context, he had developed a strong, dreamy cosmic longing and fantasizing from childhood on. It had led him to study physics. The core of this fantasy was the idea of floating all alone and lonely in the universe among the stars. A specific memory from his second year showed that this fantasy was rooted in real personal history. As a small child he had observed the stars at night through the window. He waited for their appearance with an excitement mixed with anxiety. His flight into space also served to remove him from very unpleasurable situations in his parental home. The strong inhibition I mentioned earlier sprang from precisely those painful experiences that led him to study the universe. But, at the same time, they remained as permanent inhibitions on his capacity for surrender and as a block to his organ sensations. As we approached the liberation of his orgastic sensations, a severe anxiety emerged, an anxiety that was at the heart of his work block. It was the same anxiety he had developed as a child due to his powerful organ sensations. In organ sensation, man experiences the orgone function of nature in his own body. Now this function was charged with anxiety and therefore inhibited. Our physicist wanted to devote himself to argon biophysics because he was convinced of its accuracy and significance. He had seen the argon in the metal room and described it in detail. But whenever he was supposed to do practical work, a strong inhibition set in, the same inhibition based on the fear of total surrender, of unquestioning abandon to his own body sensations. In the process of argon therapy, the sequence of moving forward and fearfully retreating was repeated so often and so typically that there could be no doubt that the fear of organ sensations and the fear of scientific argon research were identical. The reactions of hatred that came to the surface were the same that one encounters in ordinary relations with physicists and physicians regarding the argon. Our clinical experience may be generalized. It is the fear of autonomic organ sensations that blocks the capacity to observe argon energy. Self-perception is the deepest and most difficult problem of all natural science. The understanding of sensation will also pave the way for understanding self-perception. We recognize the capacity for sensation in living organisms by their response to stimuli. This response is inseparably connected with an emotion, in other words, with the motion of protoplasm. We know that an organism has perceived the stimulus when it responds with movement. Emotional stimulus response is functionally identical with sensation, not only quantitatively but also qualitatively. Just as all stimuli affecting an organism can be reduced to two basic forms, pleasurable and unpleasurable, all sensations can be basically reduced to two fundamental emotions, pleasure and unpleasure. This fact was already known to pre-Freudian psychology. It was clarified by Freud with his libido theory. The accomplishment of argon biophysics was that it succeeded in functionally equating pleasure with biological expansion, and unpleasure, or anxiety, with biological contraction. Expansion and contraction are basically physical functions that can be found even in the inorganic realm of nature. They comprise much wider areas than emotions. It may be assumed that there is no emotion without expansion or contraction, but that expansion and contraction function without emotion, as, for instance, in the atmospheric argon. We reach the conclusion that the emotions, at a certain point in the development of living matter, are added to argonautic expansion and contraction when certain conditions are fulfilled. For the moment we assume that emotion is tied to the existence and movement of protoplasmatic substance within a circumscribed system and, without this precondition, does not exist. But in another context we will encounter the susceptibility of the purely physical argon to stimuli when we discuss the medium of electromagnetic waves. Many problems are still awaiting concrete answers. But regardless of the many obscurities blurring our vision, it is certain that from now on sensation and emotion are found within, and no longer outside, the physical view of nature. Mechanistic natural research must exclude sensation because it cannot grasp it. But since sensation and emotion are the direct and least doubtful experience of the living organism, they were bound first to strike the attention of the natural philosophy of antiquity and to press for an answer. In his book Meeting of East and West, Northrop explains the importance of direct organ sensation for the entire natural philosophy among ancient Asiatic cultures. It was not ascribed to some god. It was treated within the framework of physical functions and attributed to special, particularly smooth, and exceptional, atoms. This ancient view is far superior to that of modern natural science and comes closer to the natural processes. The primitive view of emotional life was not mystical, as is our view today, neither was it spiritualistic or metaphysical. It was animistic. Nature was regarded as animated, but this animation was derived from man's own real sensations and experiences. The spirits had human form, the sun and the stars acted like real, living people. The souls of the dead continued to live in real animals. The primitive animistic intellect did not change the world within or without. The only thing it did in contradiction to natural scientific philosophy was to ascribe real functions to real objects where they did not belong. It placed its own reality into an alien reality, that is, it projected. The primitive intellect reasoned very close to probability when it equated the fertility of the earth with the fertility of the female body, or when it regarded the rain-bearing cloud as a being capable of perception. Primitive man animated nature according to his own sensations and functions. He animated them, but he did not mysticize them, as did his successor several hundred years later. Mysticism here means, in the literal sense, a change of sensory impressions and organ sensations into something unreal and beyond this world. Anthropology teaches us that the devil with tail and pitchfork, or the angel with wings, is a late product of human imagination, not patterned on reality but originating from a distorted concept of reality. Both devil and angel correspond to human structural sensations that deviate basically from those of animals or primitive men. Likewise, hell and heaven, formless, blue-gray ghosts, dangerous monsters and tiny pygmies are projections of unnatural, distorted organ sensations. The process of animating the surrounding world is the same with the animistic primitive as it is with the mystic. Both animate nature by projecting their body sensations. The difference between animism and mysticism is that the former projects natural, undistort organ sensations, while the latter projects unnatural, perverted ones. In both cases we can draw conclusions about the emotional structure of the organism from mythology. But we can also discern the radical difference. It forms the transition from a biological form of existence to a basically disparate life form of the human animal. We can still describe animism as a realistic conception of nature, even if the animating idea and the animated object do not concur in reality. For both idea and object are objective, unchanged realities. But we cannot regard mysticism as a true conception of nature because not only the outer but also the individual inner world has deviated from the law of nature, they have changed. Animism takes for granted a soul in a cloud or the sun, which is not correct, but it does not tamper with the form and function of such natural objects. A devil or an angel, on the other hand, no longer corresponds to any reality, neither in form nor in function. The only reality at the root of this mystic kind of animation is the distorted organ sensation of armored man. This discussion is of decisive importance in clarifying several basic questions of natural research. Later we shall see that Kepler had an animistic concept of planetary functions which we should not confuse with mysticism, although he has often been accused of it. Furthermore, it is known that Galileo, who established the mechanistic functional laws, was not on good terms with Kepler. We will also find an animism in Newton that we will have to understand. It is important to dissociate ourselves from the unfounded superiority of the mechanists, who dismissed as mysticism the animistic efforts of a Kepler or Newton to comprehend the harmonic law of nature. We will have to demonstrate that our mechanists are far more mystical than they themselves suspect, and far more remote from nature than primitive animists. History shows that mechanistics in the natural sciences developed not as a reaction against the animism of a Democritus or a Kepler but against the rampant mysticism of the Church in the Middle Ages. The Christian Church had exchanged the nature-oriented animism of prehistoric science and the vitality of its own founder for a mysticism remote from life and nature. The mystical bishop sent the animistic witch to be burned as a heretic. Till Eulenspiegel was a nature-oriented animist, Philip II of Spain was a sadistic brutal mystic. Functional natural science must defend primitive animism against perverse mysticism and take from it all elements of experience corresponding to natural sensory perceptions. Narrow-minded mechanists of natural science reproach functionalism for being mystical. This blame rests on the assumption that those who try to understand mysticism are mystical. The mechanist does not understand emotional processes at all. To him, they are alien experiences, and they are equally foreign as the object of investigation. In a manual of neurology or organ pathology one will look in vain for a study of the emotions. The emotions, however, are the experiential material of mysticism. Therefore, the narrow-minded mechanist concludes that those who deal with emotions are mystics. The understanding of emotions is so remote to the mechanist's thinking that there is no room for it in his natural scientific investigation. Functionalism is simply not capable of overlooking the emotions and can include them in the realm of natural scientific research. The mechanist regards this as mysticism because they confuse mysticism with the study of mysticism. For mechanistic pathology, functional illnesses are imaginary illnesses. When the mechanistic physician cannot ascertain any alteration in the chemical composition of the blood or in the structure of the tissues, he cannot diagnose an illness, even if the patient actually does. The functionally oriented physician, the Argon therapist, knows about the bodily function of the emotions.